I heard my boyfriend's name in a true crime podcast. 20 minutes later, everyone I loved was in danger. I was listening to a podcast about an unsolved case from 15 years ago, where the host was describing a home invasion where an entire family was killed except for one person who disappeared that night. The only survivor was a teenage boy named Ethan Crawford who fled the scene and was never found, the host said. Then they cut to an interview with someone who claimed to have new information. I actually think I saw him about 2 years ago. He was going by the name Danny Gillespie and living in Portland, Oregon. I recognized him from the old photos. I froze because my boyfriend's name was Danny Gillespie and we lived in Portland. I walked into the living room where Danny was sitting on the couch. Babe, someone on this podcast just said they saw the missing person using your exact name in Portland. I thought he'd laugh about what a weird coincidence it was, but instead all the color drained from his face. We need to leave right now, he said, standing up. He was already grabbing his keys and wallet. Pack a bag with only essentials, we have maybe 20 minutes before they get here. My heart started racing because his voice was completely different. Danny, you're scaring me. What's going on? He grabbed my shoulders. My real name is Ethan Crawford, and I was at that house 15 years ago when my family was killed. I've been hiding ever since, and if that podcast just broadcast my current name and location, the people who did it are going to find me. I felt like the floor disappeared. That's insane. You work in tech. I've been to your childhood home. He ran into the bedroom. That's all fake. I've been running for 15 years. He pulled a duffel bag from the closet. Inside were stacks of cash, 3 different IDs, and a weapon. How long have you been lying to me? He looked at me while shoving clothes into another bag. About everything. My job isn't real. My past isn't real. Even my feelings for you started as something else. He handed me a backpack. Put clothes and documents in here. No phone, no laptop. I started packing on autopilot. Why did they kill your family? He stopped. My father was going to testify. They killed everyone to send a message. I only survived because I wasn't home that night. My phone buzzed and Danny grabbed it. He looked at the screen and went paler. They're already here. He showed me a photo of our apartment building taken from across the street. He threw my phone against the wall. These people have been looking for me for 15 years. The second that woman said my name and this city, they probably had people mobilizing. He pulled a second weapon from under the mattress. Do you know how to use this? I shook my head. Then stay behind me, and if I tell you to run, you run. We went to the front door and he looked through the peephole, then pulled back. There's someone in the hallway. My entire body went cold. Is there another way out? He shook his head. Fire escape ends in an alley where they'll be waiting. There was a knock. Danny Gillespie, we just want to talk. Danny pushed me toward the bathroom. Get in the tub and stay down no matter what you hear. The door exploded inward and Danny fired twice. I heard someone fall and more footsteps coming up the stairs. He grabbed my arm. We're going out the window, stay low. We climbed onto the fire escape and I could hear shouting from inside. We made it down 1 level before someone started shooting from below. Danny fired back and pulled me toward a ladder to the next building's roof. We ran across 2 rooftops before climbing down into a different alley. A car pulled up and Danny raised his weapon before a man yelled, "It's me, get in!" Danny shoved me into the back and jumped in. The man drove away fast as people came running around the corner. Who are you? I asked. The man looked at me in the mirror. I'm James. I've been helping Ethan hide for 15 years, moving money around, creating new identities. Danny was breathing hard. How did they find me so fast? James looked grim. That podcast went viral in the last hour. Someone screenshot the part about Portland and your name. I couldn't process any of this. Danny turned to me and his whole face was different. I need to tell you something else. The reason I approached you wasn't random. Your father was supposed to testify with my father 15 years ago. He went into hiding at the last minute. The organization has been looking for both our families. I found you to protect you and find your father. Everything stopped. My father sells insurance in Denver. James spoke up. Your father's been using the name Richard Hayes for 15 years. His real name is Michael Bain. He was my father's business partner. They both witnessed the same crime. Then I remembered something from the podcast. They mentioned another name. They said they were looking for Michael Bain and thought he might be in Colorado. Danny's face went white. Did they say anything else? My mind raced. They said someone claimed to have seen him recently. James hit the steering wheel. If they mentioned Colorado, they're already on their way to your father. James took a sharp left turn and I gripped the seat as we sped through narrow streets I didn't recognize. My boyfriend wasn't my boyfriend and my father wasn't dead and people were actively trying to kill us right now. I kept looking at the back of Ethan's head while he twisted around every few seconds to check behind us. He'd been doing this for 15 years, living like prey, and I'd had no idea because I was too busy believing his lies about working in tech and growing up in Seattle. James cut through an alley and came out on a different street, then made 3 more random turns before heading toward what looked like the industrial district. My hands were shaking and I realized I was still holding the backpack I'd packed in maybe 30 seconds before our apartment exploded with gunfire. Everything I owned was back there. My laptop with all my photos, my clothes, the jewelry my mom gave me for graduation, just sitting there while strangers with weapons went through it looking for clues about where we went. We pulled into an underground parking garage beneath some kind of warehouse, and James drove to the back corner where another car was waiting. He got out fast and started transferring bags between vehicles while Ethan finally turned to look at me directly. His face was different now, harder somehow, like he'd dropped a mask I didn't even know he was wearing. He opened his mouth like he was going to say something, but James interrupted. We needed to move now, switch vehicles every few hours so they couldn't track us. I climbed into the new car, a plain sedan that smelled like coffee and cigarettes, and we were moving again before I even got my seatbelt on. Ethan was in the passenger seat now, and he kept his eyes on the side mirror, watching for cars that might be following us. James drove back up to street level and headed for the highway going south. Nobody spoke for maybe 10 minutes, and the silence felt heavy and wrong. Then Ethan turned in his seat to face me and started talking. He said he spent 2 years searching for my father after he got old enough to start looking on his own. He tracked down every Michael Bain in the country, followed dead ends, paid people for information that went nowhere. Then he found me instead, found my social media and my address, and realized I was the daughter. He figured if he got close to me, I might eventually lead him to where my dad was hiding. Maybe I'd mention something useful, or maybe my dad would reach out to me and Ethan would be there to see it. So he engineered a meeting at the coffee shop where I went every morning before class. He learned my schedule and my habits, and he made sure we kept running into each other until I thought it was fate or luck or whatever stupid thing I believed about the universe bringing people together. My chest felt tight and I couldn't get enough air. I asked him if anything between us was real, any of it, even one moment. He went quiet for way too long, and I watched him trying to decide what to say. Finally, he said it started as surveillance but became complicated. That was it. That was his answer. Complicated. It hurt worse than if he'd just said no because it meant he was still calculating, still deciding what truth to give me and what to hold back. I wanted to scream at him or hit him or jump out of the moving car, but I just sat there feeling numb. James cut in and said we needed to focus on getting to Colorado before the organization found my father. He pulled out a laptop from under his seat and opened it while steering with one hand. He turned it so I could see the screen, and there was the podcast episode, the one that started all of this maybe 2 hours ago. It already had 200,000 downloads, and the comment section was full of people theorizing about where Ethan might be now. Someone had screenshot the part about Portland and Danny Gillespie and posted it everywhere. Another person was discussing possible locations in the city based on property records they'd found online. The internet had basically done the organization's work for them, narrowed down the search area to a few square miles. James closed the laptop and said we had maybe a 12-hour head start if we were lucky. We stopped at a rest area 2 hours outside Portland, and James got out to make calls to his contacts. Ethan and I sat in the car in awkward silence, and I tried to figure out which emotion to feel first. Should I be more angry about the lies, or more terrified about the people hunting us? Both feelings were fighting for space in my brain, and I couldn't process either one properly. I looked out the window at families walking to the bathrooms and getting snacks from vending machines, living their normal lives while I sat here learning everything I knew was fake. Ethan started talking without me asking him to. He told me about the night his family died, how he'd been at a friend's house and came home late to find cop cars and ambulances everywhere. He went in through the back window because he knew something was wrong and he found everyone already gone. His parents, his little sister, even the dog. Blood everywhere and silence, and he barely made it out before the people who did it came back to check their work. He'd been running ever since, changing identities every few years, never staying anywhere long enough to build a real life or make real friends or trust anyone. James had been helping him the whole time, moving money around, creating new identities, teaching him how to disappear. I realized my father made the same choice, but at least he got out before the violence reached us. I asked Ethan if he knew why my dad went into hiding instead of testifying like he was supposed to. Ethan explained that my father was supposed to testify the same week as Ethan's dad, but someone tipped him off about the planned attack. My dad had maybe 6 hours warning, and he used it to disappear, left my mom and me behind with some story about needing to leave for work. He probably thought he was protecting us by keeping us in the dark, but instead he just made us easy targets if anyone ever connected us to him. James came back to the car, and his face looked grim. He said his contacts confirmed the organization sent teams to both Portland and Denver within an hour of the podcast going live. We were lucky to get out when we did, but my father might not know anyone was coming for him yet. If he was still using the same identity after 15 years, he might think he was safe, might have gotten comfortable. We got back on the road and I pulled out the phone Ethan had given me, a burner he said was safe to use. I tried calling the number I had for my dad, the one I'd used maybe 3 times in 15 years when my mom managed to arrange supervised contact. It went straight to a disconnected message and my stomach dropped. Either my father had changed numbers again, or something had already happened to him and we were too late. Ethan turned around in his seat and looked at my face. He asked what was wrong and I just stared at the phone in my hand for a second before telling him the number was disconnected. I explained that I barely knew my father anyway because my mom told me he left us when I was 7 years old. She said he moved away for work and didn't want to be part of our lives anymore. I grew up thinking my dad just abandoned us, that he chose his career over his family and never looked back. I had no idea he was in witness protection, or that any of this was connected to organized crime or people getting killed. My whole childhood was built on a lie, and now I was supposed to just accept that everything I believed about my family was fake. James kept his eyes on the road but spoke up from the driver's seat. He said my mother probably didn't know the full truth either, that witness protection keeps families separated and in the dark to prevent exactly this kind of situation. If my mom knew where my dad was or why he really left, she could accidentally give away information or be used as leverage. The whole system was designed to make sure no one knew anything, which meant my mom spent 15 years thinking her husband abandoned her when really he was trying to protect us. But now that the organization knows to look for Michael Bain's family, my mom might be in danger too. They would figure out that Michael had a wife and daughter, and if they couldn't find him, they might try to use us to draw him out. I grabbed Ethan's arm and told him to give me his phone right now. He handed it over without arguing, and I dialed my mom's number with shaking hands. She answered on the third ring, sounding confused about the unknown number. I didn't give her time to ask questions, just said she needed to leave the house right now and go stay with her sister without explaining why. I tried to keep my voice calm so she wouldn't panic, but my hands were gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. My mom started asking what was going on and why I was calling from a strange number. She wanted to know if I was okay and where I was and what kind of trouble I was in. I just kept repeating that she needed to leave immediately, and I would explain everything later. I told her to pack a bag and get in her car and drive to Aunt Sarah's house and not tell anyone where she was going. My voice kept getting higher and faster, and I could hear the fear bleeding through no matter how hard I tried to sound normal. She finally agreed because she could hear something was really wrong in my voice. She said she was grabbing her purse and would leave in 5 minutes. I told her I loved her and ended the call before she could ask anything else. James switched lanes and merged onto a different highway heading east. He said we were going to drive through the night to put as much distance as possible between us and Portland. Ethan and James would take turns at the wheel while I tried to sleep in the back seat, but I knew sleep wasn't going to happen. We drove for hours with James behind the wheel first, while Ethan sat in the passenger seat watching the mirrors constantly. I lay down in the back and closed my eyes but kept startling awake every few minutes. Every set of headlights behind us felt like a threat, like maybe the organization had found us again and was following us across state lines. I would drift off for maybe 10 minutes and then jerk awake thinking I heard gunshots or feeling the car swerve. I caught Ethan watching me in the mirror with an expression I couldn't read. It might have been concern or guilt or maybe just calculation, and I hated that I couldn't tell the difference anymore. We stopped once for gas at a station in the middle of nowhere, and James paid cash while Ethan and I stayed in the car. Nobody spoke much during the drive. The sun came up somewhere in Idaho, and we pulled into a truck stop near the border to switch drivers and use the bathroom. I went inside and splashed water on my face in the bathroom sink, staring at my reflection and barely recognizing the person looking back. When I came out, James was standing by the car with his phone pressed to his ear, and his face had gone completely pale. Ethan was pumping gas and saw James's expression at the same time I did. We both walked over as James ended the call. He told us that someone just tried to grab my mom from her house about an hour ago. 2 men showed up claiming to be police officers and tried to force their way inside, but she had already left following my warning. They missed her by about 20 minutes, and the neighbors called real police when they saw the men breaking down the door. The reality hit me like a punch in the stomach. These people would kill anyone connected to the witnesses, and my mom almost died because of secrets my father kept from us. She came within 20 minutes of being kidnapped or murdered by people looking for information she didn't even have. I felt anger rising up and replacing the fear, hot and sharp in my chest. I was mad at my dad for disappearing and leaving us vulnerable. I was mad at my mom for lying about why he left even if she didn't know the truth. I was mad at Ethan for using me as bait to find my father and putting me in danger without telling me what was really happening. Everyone in my life had lied to me, and now people were trying to kill my family because of choices made 15 years ago that nobody bothered to explain. Ethan tried to apologize again, starting to say something about how he never meant for things to go this way. I cut him off and told him I didn't want to hear it right now, because I needed to focus on staying alive and finding my father before the organization did. We could deal with relationship drama later if we survived long enough for it to matter. He backed off, but I could see the hurt on his face, which was confusing because I didn't know if his feelings were real or just more manipulation. Maybe he actually cared about me, or maybe he was just good at pretending. Either way, it didn't change what he had done or the situation we were in now. We got back in the car with Ethan driving this time and crossed into Utah as the morning sun got higher. James pulled out a map and explained that we were taking a longer route to avoid major highways where the organization might have people watching. The interstate would be faster, but also more dangerous, because there were only so many routes from Portland to Denver, and they might have set up surveillance. This back road route was going to take us almost 2 days to reach Denver, winding through smaller towns and state highways that added hours to the trip. We had no idea if my father was even still alive, or if the organization had already found him while we were busy running. I asked James how he got involved in all this in the first place. He glanced at me in the mirror and explained he was a federal agent 15 years ago who helped Ethan's family prepare to testify. He was part of the team setting up their protection and making sure they had everything they needed to stay safe until the trial. When the protection failed and everyone died, he felt responsible for not seeing the threat coming. He quit the agency and spent the last 15 years helping Ethan survive outside the official system, moving money around and creating new identities and teaching him how to disappear. He had been breaking laws and risking prison to keep one kid alive because he couldn't save the rest of the family. That realization sat heavy in my chest as we kept driving through the dark Utah landscape. James was breaking federal laws and risking prison time to keep Ethan alive, and now he was doing the same thing for me, even though we'd just met a few hours ago. I couldn't tell if that made him some kind of hero or just someone who couldn't let go of his guilt, but at least I understood why he was helping us. Ethan's motivations were still a mess of lies and half-truths that I couldn't sort through. We drove for another 3 hours before James pulled off at a tiny motel that looked like it hadn't been updated since the 1970s. He paid cash for a room with 2 beds, and we hauled our bags inside. The room smelled like old cigarettes and cleaning chemicals. James said he'd take first watch and told us to try to sleep. I lay down on one of the beds fully clothed and stared at the water-stained ceiling tiles. My brain wouldn't stop replaying everything that had happened in the last day. 24 hours ago, I was listening to a podcast in my apartment with no idea my entire life was built on lies. Now I was in a motel room in the middle of nowhere with a boyfriend who wasn't really my boyfriend, and a former federal agent who'd gone rogue. I heard Ethan shift on his bed, and then he sat up on the edge of it. He started talking quietly, saying that what he told me about his feelings was actually true, even though how we met was completely fake. He said he never planned on falling for me, and it made everything way more complicated than it was supposed to be. His voice was different from I'd ever heard it, softer and less controlled. I wanted to believe what he was saying, but I had no idea how to trust someone who'd already admitted they approached me as part of some plan to find my father. Every nice thing he'd ever said or done could have been calculated. Every kiss could have been strategy. I told him we needed to focus on staying alive first, and we could deal with the relationship stuff later, if there even was a later for us. He went quiet, and I could feel him looking at me in the dark, but I kept my eyes on the ceiling. Eventually, I heard him lie back down. I must have fallen asleep at some point because James was shaking my shoulder, and pale morning light was coming through the thin curtains. Ethan was already up and packing his bag. James's phone was in his hand, and his face looked grim. He said he'd just gotten a call from his contacts, and the news wasn't good. The organization had people actively searching Colorado right now, and they'd figured out several possible locations where my father might be living, based on the podcast's hints about the Denver area. My stomach twisted. We were still maybe 12 hours away from Denver if we drove straight through. James said we couldn't just drive into the city without knowing exactly where my father was, because we'd be going in blind and the organization probably had people watching likely locations. Ethan suggested we try to find property records or utility bills under the name Richard Hayes to get an actual address. James nodded and said he had a contact who could access those databases without leaving any kind of trail that could be tracked back to us. He made a call while Ethan and I grabbed stale muffins from the motel's sad excuse for a breakfast area. The contact said it would take a few hours to search through the records and cross-reference everything. We got back in the car and started driving closer to Denver while we waited. I tried not to think about what we'd find when we got there. Every mile that passed felt like we were racing against people who had more resources and more experience than us. I asked Ethan what the actual plan was if we found my father still alive. He was quiet for a minute and then admitted he didn't really have a plan beyond warning him and trying to get everyone somewhere safe. The problem was there wasn't anywhere actually safe as long as the organization existed and wanted us dead. They had people everywhere and unlimited money to keep searching. We could run for another 15 years like Ethan had been doing, but that wasn't really living. It was just surviving. We stopped for gas at a station outside Grand Junction, and James's phone rang. He answered and listened for a long time, then thanked whoever was on the other end. He told us his contact had come through with an address for a Richard Hayes living in a suburb called Lakewood, about 20 minutes outside Denver proper. We were close enough now that we could be there in 6 hours if we pushed straight through without stopping. Ethan wanted to approach carefully and scout the location first to see if the organization had already found it. I understood being careful, but I was worried that if we waited too long, the organization would find my father before we did. We'd be too late to warn him. We went back and forth about it while James drove and finally compromised. We'd drive past the house once to see if there were any obvious signs of trouble before we made contact. If everything looked normal, we'd approach. If we saw anything suspicious, we'd figure out another way. The sun was getting lower as we crossed into Colorado, and I realized I was about to see my father for the first time in 15 years. I had no idea if he'd even recognize me or what I was supposed to say to him. The last time I saw him, I was 7 years old, and he was just my dad who went to work and came home and read me bedtime stories. Now he was a stranger who'd been living under a fake name and had evidence that could bring down a criminal organization. I didn't know that person at all. We crossed into Colorado around noon, and I couldn't stop checking the mirrors like Ethan had been doing for the past 12 hours. Every car behind us felt like a threat. Every exit we passed made me wonder if we should take it and disappear somewhere else instead of driving straight into whatever was waiting in Denver. Ethan sat in the passenger seat cleaning one of the weapons he'd grabbed from the apartment. His hands moved automatically like he'd done this 1,000 times before. I watched him and tried to match this version of him with the guy who used to make me breakfast and complain about his fake tech job. They didn't line up in my head. James kept the speed exactly at the limit. Requested Reads is on Spotify now. Check out link in the description or comments. He explained that getting pulled over now would be the worst possible thing. We had weapons, fake IDs, and a trunk full of cash that would raise every red flag if a cop searched the car. My stomach felt tight and I realized I hadn't eaten anything since those stale muffins at the motel. Food seemed impossible right now. The landscape changed as we got closer to the city. Mountains appeared in the distance and houses started showing up more frequently along the highway. Ethan put the weapon away and pulled out his phone to check the address James had gotten from his contact. He zoomed in on a map of Lakewood and studied the streets around my father's house. He pointed out which roads had the best escape routes, and which ones could trap us if things went bad. I listened to him plan like we were robbing a bank instead of trying to save my father's life. The sun started dropping lower, and the light turned orange across the buildings as we took the exit into Lakewood. James drove slowly through residential streets while Ethan watched everything. Normal people were coming home from work and walking dogs and living regular lives. They had no idea we were driving past them with weapons and running from people who killed entire families. We turned onto the street where my father lived, and James slowed down even more. The houses here were small and old but well kept. Lawns were mowed and cars sat in driveways. Everything looked completely normal. Then Ethan pointed ahead at a dark sedan parked on the right side about 4 houses down from the address we had. The car had tinted windows and plates from out of state. A man sat in the driver's seat looking at his phone, but his posture was too alert. He was watching something. James drove past without stopping, and I looked at the house with the address we were looking for. It was plain and beige with a small porch and nothing special about it. My father had been living there for 15 years and I'd never known. We turned at the corner and James circled the block. Ethan scanned the other streets and his face got harder. He told James to slow down and pointed at another vehicle parked on the opposite corner from the first one. This one was a dark SUV with 2 people inside. They were positioned to watch the same house from a different angle. The organization had found my father. They were already here sitting and waiting. James kept driving and pulled into an alley 2 blocks away. He parked and turned off the engine. We all sat there for a minute while the reality sank in. Those people outside my father's house were probably the same ones who killed Ethan's family 15 years ago. They were waiting for orders or for my father to come outside or for the right moment to go in. Ethan said we needed to move now before they got tired of watching. If they decided to go in while we were still planning, my father would be dead before we could warn him. James asked if we should call the police, but Ethan reminded him that the organization had people inside law enforcement. Calling the cops might just bring more of them. We had to do this ourselves. I felt sick thinking about what could go wrong, but doing nothing meant letting my father die. James drove around to the alley behind my father's street. We got out and moved between houses, staying low and trying to look like we belonged there. My heart was beating, so hard I could feel it in my throat. We crossed through 2 backyards and I kept expecting someone to come out and yell at us for trespassing. Nobody did. We reached the back of my father's house and crouched behind a fence. Ethan looked at the back door and the windows, checking for alarms or cameras. He didn't see any. He pulled out a small toolkit from his jacket and went to work on the lock. I stood there watching him break into my own father's house, and the whole situation felt insane. The lock clicked and Ethan pushed the door open slowly. We stepped inside and I was in my father's kitchen for the first time ever. Everything was quiet and normal. Dishes sat in the drying rack next to the sink. A coffee maker sat on the counter with a half-full pot. The refrigerator hummed. We moved through into a hallway and I saw photos on the walls. Mountains and lakes and places I didn't recognize. No pictures of people. No pictures of me or my mom or his old life. Just empty landscapes like he'd tried to erase every connection to who he used to be. The living room had a couch and a TV and books on shelves. Mail sat on a small table addressed to Richard Hayes. This was where my father had been living his fake life while I grew up thinking he'd abandoned us. I heard footsteps and froze. A man came out of what looked like a bedroom holding a coffee mug. He was older than I remembered, with gray hair and lines on his face that hadn't been there 15 years ago. He'd gotten thinner too, like stress had worn him down over time. But his eyes were the same. I recognized those eyes from old photos and distant memories. He looked at us standing in his living room and his whole body went rigid. The mug shook in his hand. He stared at me specifically and his face changed. Color drained out of it. His mouth opened but nothing came out. He looked at me like he was seeing something impossible. Like he was seeing a ghost of someone he'd lost. I said the word before I could think about it. Dad. My voice cracked on that single syllable. His hand opened and the mug fell. It hit the floor and exploded into pieces. Coffee splashed across the tile. He took one step toward me and then stopped like he wasn't sure if I was real. His eyes filled up and I could see 15 years of everything on his face. Guilt and grief and fear and relief all mixed together. He was looking at his daughter who he'd left when she was 7 years old. I was standing in his living room at 22 and he'd missed everything in between. Every birthday and graduation and moment of my life had happened without him. His hands were shaking. Ethan moved forward and his voice cut through the moment. He told my father we didn't have time for this because the organization had people watching the house right now. My father's face changed instantly from emotion to fear. He knew exactly what that meant. He turned and ran to a closet in the hallway. He pulled out a bag that was already packed. Inside, I could see clothes and cash and documents like he'd been ready to run at any second for 15 years. He'd lived here with an escape bag in his closet the whole time, never unpacking completely, never settling in, always ready for the moment when they would find him. That bag was the saddest thing I'd ever seen. He turned back to me and words started pouring out. He said he was sorry for everything. Sorry for leaving and for the lies and for not being there. He said he'd wanted to contact me so many times, but they told him any communication would put me in danger. His voice broke and I realized he'd been crying about this for 15 years. He'd been living in his own kind of prison, trapped by the same organization that killed Ethan's family, separated from everyone he loved because staying away kept us safer. He'd given up his entire life to protect us, and we never even knew he was protecting us. We thought he'd just left. James spoke up from behind us. He explained we needed to leave through the back door right now and get to the car before the surveillance team outside figured out something was happening. My father nodded and grabbed his bag. He moved toward the back of the house and I could tell he'd practiced this route before. He knew exactly which way to go and how to move quickly without making noise. He'd probably run through this escape plan in his head 1,000 times. We followed him through the kitchen and out the back door. He locked it behind us out of habit even though we were never coming back here. This house and this life as Richard Hayes were over. We moved between the houses heading back toward the alley where James had parked. I kept looking back, expecting to see men with guns coming after us, but the yard stayed empty. We reached the car and piled in. James started the engine and pulled out of the alley. My father sat in the back seat next to me, breathing hard. He reached over and grabbed my hand. He squeezed it tight like he was afraid I might disappear. We were halfway across the backyard when I heard shouting from the street. The sound cut through everything and my whole body went cold. Ethan's head snapped toward the noise and he grabbed my arm hard. James's car was visible in the alley and the watchers must have spotted it because men were running toward us from both directions. My father kept pace despite his age, and I realized fear makes you faster than you think possible. We sprinted across the grass and jumped a low fence into the next yard. Ethan pulled me forward and I could hear footsteps pounding behind us getting closer. We reached the alley and James already had the car running with the door open. Ethan shoved me into the back seat and my father dove in beside me. James hit the gas before Ethan even got his door closed. 2 men came running around the corner behind us with weapons raised. I heard the first gunshot and ducked down. The back window exploded and glass sprayed everywhere. Pieces hit my hair and neck and I felt the sharp sting of cuts. James kept driving and didn't slow down. More shots and I heard metal hitting metal as bullets struck the car. My father pushed me down lower and covered me with his body. We made it to the main street and James took a hard right. The tires screamed and I slid across the seat. Traffic was light and James weaved between cars. I sat up enough to look back and saw one of the vehicles following us. My father was breathing hard in the back seat next to me. His chest was heaving and sweat ran down his face. He grabbed my hand again and squeezed it so tight it hurt. His voice came out rough when he spoke. He told me he had something they wanted. Evidence he kept as insurance all these years. It was hidden in a storage unit across town, and it could bring down the entire organization. My mind was racing because this changed everything. Ethan turned around in the front seat and looked at my father. He asked why my dad never used the evidence before if it was that powerful. My father's face crumpled and he looked older than he had just minutes ago. He explained he was too scared and completely alone. He thought if he just stayed hidden forever and never made waves, they would eventually give up looking for him. He thought time would make them forget or move on to other targets. But he was wrong about that. They never stopped searching, and they never forgot. James spoke up from the driver's seat while taking another sharp turn. He said if the evidence was real and strong enough, we could take it to the FBI and finally end this instead of running forever. My father nodded and his hands were shaking. He gave James the address of the storage facility. His voice got stronger as he described what was inside. Financial records going back 20 years, recorded conversations between organization members, documentation of murders and criminal operations, everything needed to put dozens of people in prison for life. We were driving across Denver now, and I could see multiple cars behind us in the mirror. James was taking random turns trying to lose them. Left then, right then left again through neighborhoods I didn't recognize. My father kept talking and explaining more details. He said his business partner was the one who gathered most of the evidence. Ethan's father had access to the organization's financial systems because of his job. He copied files and recorded meetings and built a case that could destroy them. That's why they killed him and his whole family. They needed to make sure the evidence died with him. But my father had copies of everything. Ethan's face changed when he heard this. I watched him process what it meant. His father's work might actually mean something. All those deaths might not have been completely pointless if we could use the evidence to get justice. I could see him shifting from pure survival mode to actually thinking about fighting back. His jaw set in a way I'd never seen before. His whole body language changed from defensive to aggressive. We reached the storage facility and James pulled around to a back entrance. The building was old brick with rolling metal doors. My father jumped out before the car even stopped completely. He ran to a unit near the end and fumbled with keys. His hands were shaking so bad he dropped them once. Ethan and I got out and watched the road. I could see headlights in the distance getting closer. My father finally got the lock open and rolled up the door. Inside was mostly empty except for some boxes in the back corner. He grabbed a large waterproof case and ran back to the car. We got in just as 3 vehicles pulled into the facility entrance. Their headlights swept across the building. James didn't hesitate. He drove straight toward a chain-link fence at the back of the property. The metal screeched against the car as we went through it. The fence tore and bent, and we were back on city streets. Behind us, I could see the vehicles trying to follow through the gap we made. My father had the case open on his lap. Inside were USB drives in plastic bags, folders full of documents, old cassette tapes in cases with dates written on them. He said they contained recorded confessions and business discussions. Ethan reached back and started looking through the materials. He picked up folders and scanned pages. His eyes got wider as he read. He looked at my father and confirmed this was the kind of evidence that could put dozens of people in prison for life. Real names and dates and financial transactions. Proof of murders and corruption and criminal operations spanning 2 decades. This wasn't just insurance anymore. This was a weapon we could actually use to fight back. James was still driving fast and checking mirrors constantly. More cars had joined the chase behind us. I counted at least 4 vehicles now. They were coordinating and trying to box us in. James took another hard turn and we went up a ramp onto the highway. Traffic was heavier here and he used it for cover, weaving between trucks and cutting across lanes. The pursuing cars fell back slightly, but they were still there, still following, still hunting us through the city. I watched more headlights join the chase behind us and counted 6 vehicles now. James took an exit ramp and we dropped down onto surface streets where there was more traffic to hide in. My brain started working again after the shock of everything in the storage unit. My father had mentioned earlier that the organization had someone inside witness protection, someone who helped them find families that were supposed to be hidden. That meant they probably had people in regular law enforcement too. I leaned forward between the front seats and told James we couldn't just walk into an FBI office because if there was a mole in witness protection, there were probably dirty agents in other places too. We needed a way to get this evidence out where it couldn't be buried or destroyed by someone on the organization's payroll. James nodded and said he knew a federal prosecutor named Marius Cabrera, who had been trying to build a case against the organization for years, but never had enough proof. He was clean, never been bought, and had the authority to actually do something with what we were giving him. My father was looking through more of the documents in the case, and he said we should also send everything to journalists to make sure the information got public even if something happened to the legal process. Ethan turned around and mentioned the podcast host who started this whole thing, the woman named Greta Wolf, because she clearly had interest in the story and a big platform to share it with thousands of listeners. I felt weird about contacting the person whose show almost got us killed, but Ethan was right that she had the reach we needed. James spotted a public library and pulled into the parking lot. We grabbed the case and went inside, finding computers in the back corner away from other people. My father started scanning documents while Ethan copied files from the USB drives onto a cloud storage account. I watched the door for anyone following us while James set up encrypted email addresses we could use to send the access information. It took almost an hour to get everything uploaded and organized. My hands were shaking the whole time because we were sitting still for the first time since leaving my father's house, and that made us easy targets. Ethan sent the cloud storage links to both the prosecutor and the journalist with a message explaining what the files contained and instructions to publish everything if anything happened to us. It was our insurance policy, the only thing keeping the organization from just killing us all and taking the evidence. We got back in the car and James's phone rang within 10 minutes. He put it on speaker and a man's voice said, this was Marius Cabrera, and he'd received the files and was already looking through them. The prosecutor said he was mobilizing resources right now to make arrests, and we needed to come in and give official statements, but he could provide protection while the case moved forward. His voice sounded steady and sure, like someone who knew exactly what he was doing. James told him we'd meet him at a federal building downtown, and the prosecutor said he'd have U.S. Marshals waiting to escort us inside safely. We were driving toward downtown when my father's phone buzzed with an email response. The journalist Greta Wolf had written back saying she'd verified some of the documents already using her sources and was preparing a major story for her next podcast episode. She wanted to interview all of us, but we sent back a message saying we needed to focus on staying alive until the arrests happened, and we'd talk to her after. 2 different paths to getting the evidence out there where it mattered. James navigated through traffic while my father explained more about what was in the files, specific names of people in the organization, and dates of murders and financial crimes going back 20 years. Real proof that could put dozens of people in prison for life. I looked over at Ethan in the passenger seat and he was completely quiet, staring out the window. I realized this was the closest he'd ever come to actually ending the threat that had controlled his entire life since he was a teenager. 15 years of running and hiding and looking over his shoulder might actually be finished. I reached over and took his hand. He looked at me with an expression that was equal parts hope and fear, like he didn't know what would happen if we actually survived this, and he didn't have to run anymore. His fingers squeezed mine tight and we didn't say anything because there wasn't really anything to say. We were 2 blocks from the federal building when a car came out of nowhere and slammed into us from the side. The impact spun us around and I hit my head on the window. My ears were ringing and I saw armed men pouring out of multiple vehicles that had boxed us in. Gunfire erupted everywhere, bullets hitting metal and glass. James was shouting something, but I couldn't hear over the noise. Then more people appeared and I realized they were U.S. Marshals in tactical gear, returning fire and creating a protective corridor. One of them, a huge guy, yanked open our door and physically shielded us with his body. He yelled for us to run and we scrambled out of the destroyed car. I could see James firing at pursuers while my father grabbed the evidence case. We sprinted toward the federal building entrance with bullets hitting the concrete around us. The marshal stayed between us and the shooters the whole way. His name tag said Barrett. We made it through the doors and the building went into immediate lockdown. Metal barriers dropping and armed security flooding the entrance. Heavy doors slammed shut behind us, and suddenly we were surrounded by federal agents in a lobby with concrete walls and no windows. The shooting outside continued, but we were inside now, protected by layers of security and federal authority. My legs gave out and I sat down hard on the floor, my father next to me still clutching the case like his life depended on it. Ethan was checking me for injuries and James came through the doors last, blood on his shirt but moving okay. Marshal Barrett was talking into his radio, coordinating with teams outside. We'd made it, barely, but we were finally somewhere they couldn't reach us. In the conference room, Marius Cabrera sat across from us with a laptop and 3 phones going at once. He started taking our statements immediately while talking to FBI teams in different cities. He told us they were executing arrest warrants right now based on the evidence my father provided, hitting the organization in 8 cities at the same time. Every few minutes he'd get an update and relay it to us. Chicago team secured 3 targets. New York had 4 in custody. Los Angeles was moving on 2 more locations. I sat there watching this prosecutor coordinate what looked like a military operation, and it felt unreal that this was actually happening after 15 years of hiding and running. My father handed over the evidence case and Marius went through every document, every recording, making notes and sending files to different teams. He explained that they'd been building a case against the organization for years, but never had enough proof to make charges stick. What my father kept hidden all this time was the missing piece that connected everything. Over the next 6 hours, we watched news feeds on the monitors in the room as major arrests happened across the country. A city councilman in Detroit, a federal contractor in Washington, a state judge in Florida, all of them secretly working for the organization, and now all of them being walked out in handcuffs on live television. Greta Wolf's story went live at the same time, and suddenly the evidence was public record that couldn't be hidden or buried. Her article included photos of documents, audio clips of recorded conversations, and a detailed timeline of crimes going back 20 years. I watched it spread across social media in real time, people sharing and commenting and demanding answers. The organization couldn't make this disappear even if they wanted to because too many people knew now. My father sat next to me the whole time, and during breaks and questioning, he started telling me about his life in hiding. He lived alone in that small house, worked a boring office job under a fake name, and spent his evenings following my life from a distance. He kept newspaper clippings about my high school graduation and college acceptance, small pieces of my life he could hold on to. He showed me photos on his phone of me at my graduation ceremony that someone else took, and I realized he'd been there watching from far away. He said the hardest part wasn't the fear or the isolation, but knowing I was growing up thinking he abandoned us. Every birthday, every holiday, every important moment he missed because staying away kept me safer. His voice broke when he talked about it, and I didn't know what to say because I was still processing that he'd been alive and watching all these years. Later, Ethan and I finally had a real conversation about what happens next, sitting in a smaller room away from everyone else. He admitted he didn't know how to have a normal life because he'd never had one. Since he was 17, his entire existence was about survival and revenge and staying hidden. He didn't know how to think about a future that wasn't just running or fighting. I told him we were both going to have to figure out who we are now that we're not running, and that was going to take time and probably therapy. He laughed at that, a real laugh I hadn't heard from him before, and said therapy sounded good, actually. We agreed we needed to be honest about how messed up this whole thing was, how our relationship started with lies and manipulation, and how we couldn't just pretend that didn't matter. But we also couldn't ignore that somewhere in the middle of all the chaos, something real happened between us. Marius came back with an update that made everyone in the room go quiet. The arrests were holding, and they had enough evidence to keep the organization's leadership locked up for life. There would be trials, and we'd have to testify. But the immediate threat was gone. The people who killed Ethan's family and hunted us across the country were in custody and facing charges that would put them away forever. He said we could start thinking about actual futures instead of just survival, and that phrase hit me hard because I hadn't let myself think past the next day in so long. My mother arrived the next day after being brought in by federal protection, and she saw my father for the first time in 15 years. Their reunion was complicated and painful, full of things that couldn't be unsaid and time that couldn't be recovered. She was angry about the lies and the years of thinking he just left us. He was defensive about his choices and kept saying he did what he had to do to keep us safe. They stood in that federal building conference room arguing about 15 years of hurt and missed time, and I realized they might never get past it. But there was also relief that we were all alive, that the threat was finally over, and that maybe we could start rebuilding something even if it would never be what we lost. Ethan and I agreed to take things slow and actually get to know each other honestly, starting over without the lies and manipulation. He was moving into a temporary apartment near mine, and we were going to try dating like normal people, though we both knew we'd never be completely normal after everything we'd been through. We made a plan to see a therapist, both individually and together, because we had a lot to work through. He needed to process 15 years of trauma and isolation. I needed to process betrayal, and discovering my entire life was built on secrets. We needed to figure out if what we had was real or just trauma bonding, and that was going to take time and honesty we hadn't had before. 3 weeks later, I was having dinner with both my parents for the first time since I was 7 years old. We sat in a restaurant booth and it was awkward because we were all still processing trauma and figuring out how to be a family again. My mom and dad were trying to talk to each other like adults, but years of hurt kept surfacing in small comments and tense silences. I told them about school and my life, filling in 15 years of gaps, and they listened like they were trying to memorize every detail they'd missed. We were together and safe, and that was something I didn't think would ever happen again. After dinner, Ethan texted me to ask how it went. I told him it was weird and hard, but also good in a way I couldn't explain. He said he was proud of me for trying, and I realized that despite everything, we built something real in the middle of all the chaos. Maybe that was worth fighting for too, even if it meant starting over from scratch and doing the hard work of building something honest. The organization was gone. My family was alive. And for the first time in weeks, I could think about tomorrow without fear taking over everything else. Well, that's another flawless masterpiece. If you're still watching, I don't know whether to thank you or apologize. Either way, hit subscribe and we'll call it even.